Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to do a brief roundtable of discussions, like in terms of just a quick intro from everyone, just to see what your interests lie. My goal for this as outcomes, I'll just quickly go through them, is to actually understand the state of framework and language security and how we at Oels and various projects might help those languages and frameworks to come up with a common understanding, any gaps that we might identify that could, encourage future work and things like that. So just a really quick intro. I've been a participant in Oels since late 2001. I'm a lifetime member. I've been on the board. I lead the Oels Top 10 and the application security verification projects. And so obviously standardization is a thing that I do enjoy. And yeah, I've been doing application security since 1998. So let's go. Ben, can we just have a quick intro?
Yeah, so I'm looking at security controls in the media and entertainment chain. So I'm really trying to do this meta mapping of all the different controls, especially with the migration to cloud. So my interest here is looking at, I've mapped to ASVS inside that control set for application development, but just looking about how we extend that into a bit more detail. So alongside that, I've got secure config guidelines and tool sets. So it'd be great to get some of the information around the frameworks and tools put into that mix.
I'll just highlight that you might want to review, there's another session running in conjunction with this one on the ASVS with tests. I think that's a session that I'm personally going to catch up with after this. It might be worthwhile. And anyone on this is more than welcome to reach out to me afterwards, especially if you want to collaborate on certain things. So I'm really interested in that spin about the entertainment industry. I think that's actually a commonly forgotten area. Most of the controls are really focused around financial institutions, and your threat model is very different to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Paul Gerard.
Yeah, hi. I'm a developer with Glasswall. So we're working on. I've predominantly been working on securing email attachments and working in that domain. We're now diversifying our portfolio of products. I'm currently working on a proof of concept for implementing an ICAP product that will work with HTTP traffic and cleaning those. My background is predominantly in telecoms, so my experience in security area is only in the last few years, really. So I'm very much on a learning curve as far as that goes.
Okay, no worries. So I mean, essentially, one of the things that I've had feedback on the ASVS is that some parts of it are a little bit obscure and difficult to, quantify. How would you actually pass this? Like I had a question the other day on how do we actually make sure that this entropy in a JWT token is valid? And these are areas that can always be improved. So that sort of dialogue where you might be looking at something like this and come up with specific issues. I'm very interested to find out how we might be able to make that more clear. However, for today, I'm really trying to figure out, what is the framework or language that you predominantly use, and is it supporting you and your mission? So if you're using Node or Spring, whatever the case may be, I'm very interested to find out the challenges that you face and how we might be able to close that gap a little bit. Okay, yep. Alona? I think Alona might be just paused a little bit. I'll move on to Enrico. Enrico?
Yes, Andrew.
Hi, just a quick intro and what you would like to get out of this session.
I'm not entirely sure. On the one hand side, I thought this might be a bit technical, talking about various frameworks and how they could be tested, checked, how the requirements could be set up like that. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty open about it. I'm just interested in your point of view on how to get things better in using, testing, checking, setting up requirements for frameworks, this kind of stuff.
Sure. I don't know that we'll deep dive to the nth degree. Every language and every framework has its own set of problems. And, you know, if you look at Spring and we've got over 4,000 plus methods that, you know, people need to be familiar with to have a deep technical dive. I think we need to look at the principles, the idioms, and how we best support those different frameworks. I know that if you're thinking about as a full stack developer, it's really difficult to understand the full breadth of every language, let alone multiple languages. And so I'm not terribly sure that we'll deep dive. We can probably have those discussions and we might follow them up. But I certainly want to get sort of some principles on the board and, you know, sort of identify some gaps and see what we can do for future work.
And Andrew, sorry to interrupt. What I was going to do is add on to the chat the languages that my teams are using and where we're using them, and then maybe if you put that on there, then that gives you an overview of, you know, you can got it all in one place.
Okay, I'll try and get that chat up. Are you doing it on YouTube Live or on Zoom?
I'm going to do it on the Zoom.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay, so you're using Python, Node, and AWS Lambda. Okay, so you're doing Lambda and Python? Or...
Yeah, that's right. A mixture, basically a mixture of Python and Node, but really delivering that with Lambdas to do federated media cloud workflows.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I must admit I'm not particularly familiar with Python. I know what it looks like, but I'm more familiar with Node. And about 5 years ago, I was working at a company, and you know we had a workflow based on Lambda, so I'm fairly familiar with that.
Great.
Okay. Andre.
Hello, Andrew. Good morning. I apologize if there's some construction noises coming. There is some construction going on here. I have a security master's, but I'm not a security practitioner. I'm an old-time front-end developer. And I'm basically looking forward to see, well, from learning from you regarding the way that you approach things. And at the end, ask you a few questions, particularly about the way that OWASP works. Although I am a member, I have trouble trying to find a way to collaborate. So I'll be looking to ask a few questions there if you don't mind. Yeah,
I know that can be a bit daunting. I must admit, the leaders list is relatively toxic and I don't actually participate in it very often. I had to quieten down a thread the other day, but I'd certainly suggest collaboration is one of those areas that as a project member or as going to your local chapter is probably one of the easiest ways to collaborate. But certainly as a project leader of 2 major flagship projects, I'm always interested to hear from folks. Rich Fairhurst. Rich, I think you might be muted. Okay, we'll come back to Rich and Alona. They may be having audio issues, and if you are having audio issues, please just type into the chat and we can take questions from chat. I can only see the Zoom chat. I can't see the YouTube one, so I might need someone who's actually watching the YouTube channel to provide those questions to us. And Jonathan has just joined us. Jonathan, just a quick intro and what you'd like to see out of this session.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'm based in the UK. I've been to both the OS Cambridge and the OS London chapters a number of times. A lot of the work that I do is with engineering teams. So the secure by default for frameworks is something I'm very interested in. Unfortunately, one of the ones that doesn't work well in that area is OpenSSL around certificate management and stuff like that. I've done a couple of external talks on OAuth and TLS libraries around what can go wrong with them when just by using them by default. And there's always, the more you play with them, the more surprises you get, and that's an area that collectively most engineering teams don't have time to play around with all of that. So getting to getting to a place where the frameworks are secure by default would be hugely important or
Yeah.
hugely valuable.
So I was watching, I'm trying to learn Rust, and I must admit, it's quite the leap for me. It's a different language in many ways. I was watching the Reddit Rust subreddit the other day, and there's a re-implementation of SSL in Rust, and they just got a security audit, and the security auditors very rarely, in my personal experience, say much good about what they've actually just reviewed, but they're actually really quite impressed with that re-implementation of SSL. So it may be worthwhile for you to look at that. It's not a complete implementation yet, and the area that you're delving into may not be there, but it's certainly using a secure by default language that is memory safe is a huge benefit, especially as I understand the OpenSSL code base is got its own memory allocator and all sorts of things going on that just are strange and quite resistant to static code analysis.
That's I'd seen the report. It's on my reading list, but I haven't got to it yet. That does actually open a more philosophical point about language choice. Often, for existing projects or products with engineering teams, that choice has already been made. Yes. And while even with new products or projects, when you get in early as a security person, language choice is not an area that I've found easy to influence. It's often already decided, and there's often a lot of passion around language choice about what people will and what people won't use, or technical limitations as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, you've got, I've been involved in many large projects where, I was one project I worked on, which was for a logistics company, and they had a backend that was based on Siebel. And so everything that they had was, Java code hooked into Siebel. They couldn't re-platform. They really struggled with new versions of Java. So, considering a different language that might be better or more secure is just completely off the table. And so I understand exactly what you mean there. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of looking today, is to understand where those gaps might exist, because it might be a good time. One of the points that I had was what has been tried in the past and what failed. And one of those ones was ES-API. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with ES-API, but essentially it was designed as a common framework, and it was supposed to be cross-platform, and everything was supposed to be similar, but it was very Java-like. It was based out of an effort at a large financial institution to make many of the Oels top 10 go away, which was noble. However, I did the PHP port, and we got to the point where I couldn't continue because PHP didn't support Unicode, and so we couldn't pass the unit tests. And when you've got input validators, which is one of the primary reasons why you might choose something like ES-API, and you can't pass the unit tests because the language itself does not support the actual underlying, core feature of the internet, which is Unicode, that then leads you to understand that there are some huge gaps that, maybe a common framework may not be the correct approach, and we need to stick to language idioms and understand and help those languages individually rather than try to come up with a standard library of security. However, as the leader of the Oels top 10, I've got to say the Oels top 10 has failed miserably, because we still have the same things in the Oels top 10, every single release. It changes positions a little bit, but the top issues tend to be the same top 10 issues. So beating developers around the head and blaming them to say, you need to know about the Oels top 10, I think one of the things that I would like to understand from the panel is, if we say that the top 10 is the most important, how do we get rid of it? How do we actually retire the Oels top 10 from the typical languages that people would build in? Is it that we encourage people to have only database frameworks that don't have SQL injection? I mean, that stops certain types of programs. Is it along the lines of, is that a bad approach? I mean, we've been trying it for 20 years and has it really worked? I don't know. So I'd like to reach out to the panel here and just sort of say, what would help? What has worked in your experience? Are there more secure frameworks?
So just going back to the ES API, is that kind of moribund now? I've just looked at the website. It doesn't say, it's not really being taken forward. I mean, the problem here is about mass adoption, isn't it? It's about making sure that people have a common approach. And if you try and impose something on a language when people aren't really used to following that particular direction, you're not gonna get adoption. A bit like you were saying about Unicode. But it's the approach to try and make sure that for every language here's your best practice, because that would seem to be a more measured way of doing it. And hopefully, if people within that language who are actually keeping that language alive see that as being a vulnerability, they'll go and fix that. But it's in the main fork of the language rather than doing something off to the side. Because in my experience, developers want to think about security second. It's getting better, but just to say you have to do it this way because of security, you're not going to get much traction.
One of the problems with the ES API, and yes, it is moribund, is that when you adopt it, the most mature platform is Java, and it sort of assumes a Spring target. When you adopted it, when it started throwing exceptions, you needed to bring the exception class in, even if you were using just one of the classes. You needed to configure it. It wasn't just a drop-in jar file that you could actually then, just have in your program and use features from here and there. And as soon as you started having exceptions, you needed to have the ESAPI file class because it was looking for a file that it needed to get information from. And then once you started doing that, it started infecting the rest of your code. And it was difficult to adopt. If you actually had ESAPI being incorporated into a large Java program, it sort of spread its tendrils around. And so if it started being used for input validation and you were throwing exceptions, you needed to have maybe 80% of the ESAPI supported and implemented within your code. Whereas people may have just been interested in the CRSF, they may have been interested just in an input validator. And so it was very heavy-handed. I think honestly, given my time again, I probably would have worked with the Spring folks. I mean, you've got to think, ESAPI was built in the 2007 to 2009 period. Spring was getting really popular back then. And having a good Spring implementation, because they had a thing called Spring ACGI, which is now Spring Security. Working with the Spring Security team would have been a better choice and would have had wider adoption than trying to do ESAPI by itself. And I think it would have had a longer life. But then it wouldn't have been useful for Node, wouldn't have been useful for, well, any other language really. But yeah, no, ESAPI is dead, I'm afraid.
And look at the language popularity from GitHub, from the latest kind of popularity. The top one is JavaScript, then it's Python, then it's Java. So,
well, we do see a lot of, these are probably the ones where you're getting a lot of open source coders coding in the languages they prefer. And I do understand, Java, just from my own work, we see a lot of JavaScript code reviews, and that's the majority of what we see. Most full stack stuff now is JavaScript end to end.
Yeah.
Commercially, I don't see a lot of Python. I do see a lot of Java and a bit of .NET, but I would say it's certainly in the top 5, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've seen any commercial PHP. And some of those other lesser languages, like Haskell and Erlang and whatnot, they have their adherents, but you so rarely come across them. And so if we're going down the Pareto principle, I think we should definitely be concentrating on that Node.js or the React, that sort of use case. And obviously the languages that people are passionate about. Okay, so
you talked about languages. Just, with a similar take on frameworks. What are the frameworks? Because obviously they're the foundation. What do you see as the frameworks that are leading? And as you say, the open source community and what comes through GitHub. Although a lot of the enterprise shops are now using GitHub as their kind of repo. I guess that would explain the lack of weight around Java, because if you go into a big enterprise or you're inside a huge Microsoft shop, that's not going to get surfaced. But even Microsoft are now trying to push towards GitHub, aren't they?
Yeah. And I think it's a good thing because, quite frankly, as people, I mean, I'd love to see what the big repos, like if Atlassian could get like a meta study of their managed cloud repos to, you know, provide that sort of insight to them as well, because I think a lot of corporates use the Atlassian stack rather than GitHub. I'd love to see the breakdown for that. Same with GitLab for that matter.
Yeah.
I think we'd see a slightly different breakdown, but yeah, honestly, you know, the vast majority of the work that I see as brand new greenfields is going to be Node.js, Express, and React. You do see a bit of Angular. Angular is very popular in the Microsoft stack, the Microsoft world, because of the support with TypeScript. I love the fact that, you know, modern frameworks like React and TypeScript are really, and languages like TypeScript are really working towards making things safer. And I think that's a really good push. And I think, you know, to a certain degree, it's the way of the future. I mean, React apps generally don't have cross-site scripting because it's difficult. But if you've got, you know, 100,000 lines of JavaScript code that you've been supporting since like the Dojo days, you've got to work with it.
But then something. I mean, I think making sure that you know the language, the kind of the people who own the language and the frameworks are making those secure-based changes. I guess the other thing is you talked about instrumentation and using the repos as a way of getting popularity, but also what's the tool set that you'd recommend that people incorporate into their pipeline to make sure you're looking for those problems? Because again, there's a wide variety of commercial products, but what's that, you know, that foundation class of things that people should be doing? What's the recommended tool set if you for your choice of tools?
Yeah, there was a just talking about instrumentation for a tick. I mean, I honestly think there was an effort about a decade ago from NIST on I just want to get it right. I think it was Sonate. Yes, software assurance metrics and tool evaluation. It was designed primarily to discover the coverage of static code analysis tools and dynamic tools against code bases, you know, to automate things. Interestingly enough, when they had a bake-off, the company I used to work for, Aspect Security, asked, could we have some humans in the same time frame? And the humans found more and more valuable things in the same time as the tools did. So back in 2008, the tooling just wasn't there. However, if you think about, I think if we're trying to figure out gaps, it would be lovely to see if we could get some sort of a study or some sort of paper into these are the things that I think matter and what does each of the languages / frameworks actually have to help with that.
A language specific OWASP top 10, basically saying, you know, if here's the filter for the OWASP top 10 within your language, this is what's important.
Yeah, well, to a certain degree, I mean, even so, just understanding what that might look like. I don't know that we have a list at the moment. If you look at the ASVS where, you know, section 5 might have 40 or 50 level 1 controls and just sort of try to map, does the language or framework actually possess this?
Yeah.
That might be a really good start to actually understand where the gaps may lay. I do worry that we might be trying to fix something that doesn't necessarily need fixing. Like, for example, ESAPI has a cryptography class. Most languages and frameworks have the ability to handle crypto. Maybe not well, but they have something. So, you know, expending effort on trying to backport, you know, crypto, for example, would be wasteful. Whereas if a framework still doesn't have CRSF in 2020, that is a huge problem. And so I think to a certain degree, I think we need to have a little bit of a measurement to figure out where the various popular languages lay on some of these most key controls.
There are sort of multiple layers to that. You have the first one of, do they support or are they actively defending against a particular, I'll say, threat or vulnerability class? Probably use them interchangeably. And the second one is, for a particular API, what's the correct way to use it? Going back to the question on how do you get this to engineers or developers? I borrowed the NIST identify, detect, thingy, recover, just as a way of thinking about threats. That in an ideal world, you have some automated way that you can identify them, you know, static analysis or something like that, or maybe you just don't have them there in the first place, or there are other ones that you maybe you can't always detect. Yeah, with the legacy code-based cross-site scripting is one of those. A multifaceted approach in terms of working with engineering is probably working with an engineer or a developer is probably similar. So having material that shows them how to use the APIs correctly, as well as again, in an ideal world, static or dynamic analysis tools that will find instances where they've missed or used the APIs incorrectly is also ideal, because we're all human, we all make mistakes, no matter how good we are. Well, it'll be the one time that we haven't encoded a parameter correctly for cross-site scripting that gets through. Yes. And it's that, I think that in terms of providing to engineering, that multifaceted approach is needed.
But just another comment, which is, you know, we've talked here about languages and obviously you've got code, and then we talked about integration, which is really large around the APIs. The other thing I think, which is a big factor around cloud, is infrastructure as code and things like Terraform and those kind of syntaxes as to how you stat or Pulumi, how you stand up your infrastructure. And I think that's, in my experience, again, that's a very big attack surface, big area of fragility that probably needs the similar kind of scrub. So, you know, people largely have thought about applications running in a container environment, but I think you need to extend that beyond into how the applications talk to each other through the APIs, which we've mentioned, but also about how you stand up your infrastructure, maintain that infrastructure, especially when you get to instance and kind of rebooting stuff.
One of the things that I've been doing containers for a while now. If you have a bad container that has like OS command injection, you're going to have OS command injection no matter how many times you instance it. You need to have a process in place to update it. Yeah. I think one of the approaches that I've heard of, and it may be practical, it may not be practical, but essentially the concept of paved road, where the engineering team has, here is the easiest way to do it, it's the secure way of doing it, and it tries to eliminate bug classes. How many people have actually come across the paved road concept and actually apply it?
So what's the concept? Can you put it in the chat and we just go look it up?
Oh, okay, let me just find paved road.
As it paved as in P-A-V-E-D?
Yeah, sorry, my Australian accent's going to get people.
No worries.
Oops, I've sent it to Alison. Let me just send it to everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I also sent ESAPI to the wrong one, I think. Oh no, I did send it to everyone. Cool. No, it's not ASCPI, it's ESAPI. It's a dead framework from Oels. I would strongly recommend, if you actually have it in your applications today, to remove it.
It doesn't say it's dead on the front page, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a lot of maintenance of the website that does need to occur. I need to reach out to Chris Schmidt and others to see what they want to do, because that's an example of a framework that hasn't been maintained for over 5 years. And who knows if it's compatible with JDK 11 or above, and does it actually solve any modern problems? And I think if the answers are no for those things, it may need to be deprecated. But yeah, no, I mean, essentially, one of the outcomes here I'm hearing is essentially some sort of filtering to help people understand how does the top 10 or whatever apply to your particular framework or language, but also then how to actually use the correct way to use it. Back in the earliest days of OWASP, there was the OWASP Developer Guide, and I was the leader of that particular project from 2003 to 2005, and that was the last released version. And it was designed for that exact purpose, but even then it was difficult to actually have a 300-page book that literally just dealt primarily with classic ASP and Java. It was difficult. It's a lot of work, and in the meantime, no one's updated it. We've tried several times. I'll just see if I've got a copy. So this is the OWASP Developer Guide, and this is essentially how to actually do like session management properly and things like that. People don't seem to use books anymore. Is there a better way? I mean, is there an application that we should be doing? Is it some documentation in the language itself? How would we best support developers in building secure code instead of writing a 300-page book that they may not read?
Secure answers on Stack Overflow. I mean, that's a bit of a flippant answer, but having
secure guides on the cloud platforms, AWS, Azure, Google, because again, that's where people are going to land. You're right, Stack Overflow's are more of a community, but I'd say if you went back to the practice leaders at the cloud platforms and said, how should you do this properly? They're all of them really gearing up on security. They all reference OWASP, but they don't then do this practical piece. So that's probably a more practical publishing medium than a book.
Be surprised how often when I do code reviews to see Stack Exchange answers copied and pasted into code. So having the correct answer on Stack Exchange that overrides some of the other answers that are a little less great would be a good idea. Generally, AWS and Google and Azure and whatnot, they tend to write their own documentation. How would you suggest that, as OWASP, do we reach out to them and provide them assistance? Or how would you suggest that we provide them feedback?
So the project I'm doing is for the media and entertainment industry, which is a big, because it's got lots of big heavy objects that suck cloud cycles. They're all very keen to get involved, and this is driven by the Hollywood studios. So this is kind of is the MPA and the CDSA are doing it. And what I've done is done this control mapping, but then what I'm going to drive is all the different platforms to actually do secure configuration guides. So having a language specific track there would, maybe I can take some of the stuff you've got and suggest it, but I'm talking in Amazon and Azure to the top guys. Google are slightly behind the pace on it, but I'm sure that everyone will probably know who the right people are. But this is a very discrete supply chain, but it's quite well contained.
So Andre just mentioned in chat to participate in developer conferences. Absolutely.
Yeah. I must admit, about 4 or 5 years ago, I stopped applying to speak at security conferences and I only chose to speak at developer conferences. My experience of that is you don't always get selected. We should continue to try to get selected, put up talks that developers are interested in and hopefully get selected.
The other audience is testers or SDEs, security developers in test. I've had a conversation with a friend of mine who's an SDET about there's a lot of overlap between the methods used in automation and testing and what we could and should be doing in security. It's not an area that I've explored greatly, but testing conferences are another area where we could reach out to the engineering, the developer, and the tester, and the testing community. Just borrowing from Andre's idea.
We are looking at a lot of bottom-up stuff here, though. I mean, the other bit is top-down, which is if people are making selections as to what platforms they're going to. You've talked about people with obsolete code choices and where they're going. I think that kind of CISO or that CTO level that says, what is back to that mapping, that heat map of where the best languages are most being used and their best security. That would be another place to put it, because I think right at the top of the tree, when people make project choices, they'll be selecting teams to do it. I mean, you absolutely want to get into the bottom up as well, but I think something that's top down that reads back the metrics will probably drive behavior.
That's actually a really good idea. I mean, that was the next phase that I hadn't even thought about for the metrics thing that I was saying before, which, what does each language have to solve this particular problem, or does it actually solve the bug class? Yeah, having something that reads back to them would be fantastic.
And I think you probably get to be able to do some good talks at like a reInvent, or the equivalent of Azure and Google, which is just here's the headline of best choice of language, where to go, and everyone will have their own religion, but it's just if you do that at a macro level, then a CTO is going to say, right, these are the skills I want. It's kind of reinforcing the choices.
Absolutely.
The other one is when we get into sort of thinking about priority on languages, maybe to try and get, in quotes, ahead of the curve. So what is new, what is emerging now, and what does secure libraries and implementations look like in those languages? So thinking Rust, thinking Go, maybe serverless, just some.
Yeah, I mean, Rust has actually thought very seriously about how to do, get rid of memory class bugs like buffer overflows and whatnot. Go has done some significant work on concurrency. Actually, one of the funniest things about concurrency is it was actually about 45 years ago, NIST released the first special publication, and it essentially is the Oels top 10 from 1976. And one of the classes of bugs that they were worried about back then was memory concurrency. And they were thinking about it from the point of view of they could see multi-user systems coming up. The vast majority of the federal government's computers at the time were batch, and they were literally running one thing at a time in one CPU. And these guys in 1976 came up with concurrency issues as being a first-class issue. It was the only thing in the OS top 10 that we've not covered that they had in 1976. The rest of it is in the OS top 10. So things, the more they change, the less they change. But concurrency is one of those areas that I think, JavaScript developers, Node in particular, tries to pretend that it's single-threaded, but it's not. And so concurrency issues are those that I think are, an up-and-coming area that has been around for a very, very long time. And it's difficult to test, and it's difficult to figure out where the classes and the things are for the various libraries. Is that the sort of area, like that level of detail, is that one of the areas that I think developers need to know about, or is it one of those things that we need to consider more like with the language framework developers themselves rather than the end developers?
So concurrency is hard, and I mean, I've been hit by a few, and I've found a few issues in there. I'm wondering. I can't generalize concurrency issues to the point whether I know whether they're just solvable or not. I know that when we get into sort of application specific or business specific logic, you're always going to have those kind of bugs because they are, they're unique or specific to the domain or the application that exists. I don't know whether concurrency issues fall into that bucket as well. Yeah, I can't really say.
The only other area, I guess, going back to the 1976, was those kind of shared bureau services on System 360 or the big iron. And if you look at what we're now doing with the trend towards multi-tenant cloud platforms, I think you have the same potential there for your core code, your core thread within that software as a service to have that same kind of problem.
There are, running through with that as a theme, there are definitely there are definitely patterns or classes of vulnerability that apply to multi-tenant systems that, if done incorrectly, you will cross-tenant issues, etc., etc. Is that an area that anyone's explored, or is it always something that you end up looking at specific to an application? Kind of an OS top 10 for multi-tenant apps.
I've been thinking for a while. I mean, with the ASVS, what we've been trying to do is to try to make the main one the one that's across every single part of the entire spectrum from an application security perspective, which means there are going to be infrastructure ones, there are going to be cloud ones, there's going to be specific language ones, there's going to be mobile ones, and inherit from the main ASVS. And I think that's actually got a, that may be a way for us to be able to handle some of these questions. Andre asked in the chat whether or not, about surprising developers with injections and whatnot. One of the things that I think, I helped set the SANS GAC GFSP exam back in 2007. And we were required to bring a whole bunch of questions, like 300 questions each, to a working session. And one of the areas we wanted to cover was concurrency. And the three people who were working on the Java version, we all brought good questions. The problem was none of us had the correct answers. The way the language worked was different. And so if we as specialists didn't understand how concurrency works, how does a normal developer do it? And I think that's an area I think that we need to probably work with the language and framework developers rather than individual developers, because it's too complicated. In Ben's case, you've probably got big concerns about memory. Like the ability to scrape memory means you might be able to get to unencrypted, decoded streams and things like that. And so this is an area that I think, some people care very deeply about. And so things like, we're experiencing with the CPUs with hyperthreading at the moment, where you might be able to scrape keys from someone else's instance, you might be able to get content from someone else's instance.
Yeah.
And that could be a huge deal, but is it something that an average developer needs to take active work against, or is it something that frameworks and languages need to deal with?
And I think this is beyond the frameworks and the languages. This is about the what we talked about, the infrastructure. So this is something about the shared responsibility that probably, this is definitely something that an AWS or an Azure will have some knuckle dragging deep experts doing really intricate stuff, but that's probably not surfaced outside of that community. And I think it's probably worth just bringing this up because people are relying on AWS or Azure as a kind of hermetically sealed set of different pieces, but I'm not sure when you're going across virtual machines and different container technologies and you're doing auto scaling up and down and you're doing failover over regions, that something isn't left behind. And it's just, they're probably a safe way of doing it, but there's such a lot of product innovation and such a product race going on for features that it's probably worth just asking the question. But I back to you what you said. I think that's probably more a question for the internal architects of the infrastructure of the cloud platforms, rather than, because that's where you're really going to get that's where you're going to get this occurring. This is not in a code block on a development. This is in the back end configuration and provisioning. Yeah.
I think I'm absolutely 100% with you there. It's one of those things that in the ASVS, we've tried very hard not to include esoteric concerns, because we don't want developers concentrating on things that they may never, ever have to do, yet it's in level 1. Yet to a platform developer, basic concurrency primitives that work is a level 1 concern. It's not a level 3 concern. And yeah, so I mean, that's one of the areas I think maybe any sort of approach that we try to do here, the shared responsibility part, the AWS, the platforming, the PaaS type platforms, is there a set of different requirements that they need to adhere to that most developers just don't need to know?
Yeah, so I mean, in the control set, you've got a thing called CCM 301, which is the Cloud Security Alliance, and that's got a bunch of provisioning there around shared responsibility. And there's a huge degree of overlap with things like CIS, Center for Internet Security. But that Cloud Security Alliance is very weak on application development. There's only 4 controls on the application development. So that's what I've tried to do, is combine ASVS with CSA, CCM, and with CIS, plus the custom controls. But I think this is probably, although I've done this in media and entertainment, it probably has relevance out, you know, in other industry supply chains.
I'd love to have a follow-up conversation with you about that. I think we may have just briefly talked on it before, but certainly I think that's got a lot of relevance. One of the things that I was working on, we've had some approaches from a different group at the World Economic Forum and a few other places to try to align these various standards. And I think, you know, not having overlapping requirements and not having, you know, different requirements for exactly the same thing is something that I think all of the standards developers need to work better on, so that, you know, CISOs and CTOs don't have to say, well, the OS Top 10 says this, your CSA says this, you know, which one do I do? Which one's the most important?
And we've got some broken publishing models here. So we've got the open source communities, which is things like OS, which is great, but then they're volunteer efforts. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like ISO, where you have to pay, you know, 150 Swiss francs to get it, and that works really well if you're a monster corporation and you just, you know, pay your dues and who cares. But most of the development action is in supply chain is in companies of less than 100 people. So, you know, most of the software as a service applications I'm familiar with, 10, 20, 30 devs, maybe max. So or you've got individual security consultants where it's quite a significant chunk of cash to start shelling out for all this stuff. So I think this is part of the problem with, you know, it's the publishing models and the subscription models to some of these standards bodies. They're all fighting for dominance, and really what you want to do is do a meta map over the whole lot.
Yeah. One of the problems, I've actually tried to help the ISO 2734 guys. I would have had to have participated at a national level through the Australian government to sit on the panel, and there were already people selected for that. So even though I'm one of the standard setters for web application security, I couldn't participate in the ISO 2734 process. And that was extremely disappointing. And it's still coming out as less than great.
That's right, yeah. No, I mean, and this is the thing, you know, that you get a lot of the standardization and those committees are, as you say, national level, or they've been geared around really big companies who can fund full-time research engineers and standards experts. And I think when you look at supply chain and when you look at small, there's commonality with supply chain where you've got a distribution, but the kind of the median number is probably 50 to 100 people in a company, and that's the same for development. If you look at developers, how many people work in those big shops, and how many people are working in a smaller specialist? And I think that's the interesting piece.
Yeah.
And listen, apologies, I'm afraid I've got a call at 12. Really fascinating conversation. I've got to drop off, but we'll carry the conversation on afterwards. Thanks, guys.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for participating. I really appreciate it. Okay. So I think we made some good progress in this first hour. I want to use the rest of the time to discuss maybe what has worked. We're talking doom and gloom a lot and what hasn't worked. People are familiar with things that do work. I mean, I'm familiar with React, and React has basically no cross-site scripting. Rust has been working on memory stuff, and essentially it's really difficult to do buffer overflows. You can, but it's difficult, and it's easy to spot. What has worked in your experience?
I think we've just been leveraging on established technologies. So we're sitting on top of, or most of our code base sits on top of .NET. we're using static analysis to make sure that we're not bringing anything in that's going to be causing any problems. But I mean, as you said earlier in the talk, the tools aren't particularly adept, or in the timescale that you're talking about, particularly good at finding the gaping holes. But you know, that's with the timescales you've got and the level of automation you're trying to bring in, then having something in at check-in process just to give you a static scan after. I mean, we have pull requests going through as well, and so you've got at least one pair of eyes is having a second look at the code. But that's what we've been relying on, and we're not aware of any significant breaches that we've had. But that's not to say that there's not stuff in there. It's just that no one malicious have found it.
Yeah. So GitHub has some checking processes that help people understand, you know, the rats checking an AWS key or whatever. They've got a whole bunch of other things coming through. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
We're actually in dialogue with at the moment with GitHub. So one of the, I wrote it down a bit earlier, LGTM is one of the tools that we've been trialing. That's I mean, there's the free version that looks at that allows you to parse the open source repos. So, and that's been quite useful. Obviously, all our repos are open source. We've predominantly we're trying to do most of our code open source now, but we've got a core library that is the family jewels in effect. So that's definitely in a private repo. So now we're looking at the that tooling is only on the enterprise version. So we're in dialogue at the moment to trial that and see if we can get better coverage on that perspective.
Yeah, I'm always surprised with a language that is, you know, the CLR is very well understood. I'm surprised that Microsoft didn't extend the threat modeling tool to actually do static analysis of .NET code and provide a threat model, because I think that's an area that was relatively obvious to me. Threat modeling itself is subjective, but having a tool that surfaces, these are the concerns that I think you might have with this code base, that'd be amazing. And then using annotations to clean up the things that are not concerns, or, you know, we need to pay attention to this particular parameter or whatever. I think that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at LGTM, one of the limitations of that at the moment is it doesn't actually analyze the .NET framework. So it'll analyze the C# code that we're writing on top, but not the way that my understanding is it's not analyzing how we're using the .NET framework. So if, you know, if we're using the .NET framework poorly, their analysis won't report back on that. It's in the pipeline, but there's no timescales.
Daniel Cuthbert and I, one of the other co-leaders of the ASVS, is actually, we're running a DevSecOps session this afternoon, after this session. And what we are trying to do there is to identify some of these gaps and tools that developers can use that OWASP might be able to help develop in the open, or collaborate with platforms like GitHub, GitLab, and others to assist developers. Because I mean, a lot of the time, static code analysis is wrapped up in patents galore. It's very difficult for us to make any sort of progress there. But at other times, there are things that are completely obvious, like Ben mentioned, infrastructure. There's some basic tools out there that can look at cloud infrastructure configuration and whatnot. But for the average person who checks in, like, here's a Terraform script, there's just nothing that really tells you that, hey, you're just about to declare like a VPC that's got open everything. You're really relying upon the platforms that are, you know, building it to give you warnings as you do it. And maybe this is an area that at this afternoon session that we can possibly identify as a gap, and maybe make an OWASP project and get some people involved.
Yeah, that'll be useful way forward.
I just noticed that there was Andre mentioned just rolling back just very quickly, but Andre mentioned university curriculums, and I have been trying to do this for a while. I've been talking to the ACM people a little while ago. I had an interesting meeting with them back in Blackout of 2017. And that was at the end of the last time that they were developing their curriculum. The curriculum is designed for a particular type of output. So Andre, from your perspective, I absolutely 100% agree. Getting university outreach, getting university to teach things, what do you think we should try to focus on there? Is it, like, for example, is it generic software engineering, security engineering? What would you suggest?
I'll apologize if there's noise coming back or if my connection is not the best, because the video at least is not working very well for me. But the way that I was looking at this, Andrew, was more from looking at my own experience from the last 20 years developing. I would split, if I would have to talk to myself, I would talk to myself in 3 different ways. And it's pretty much the junior, the mid-level, and the senior, right? Because the levels of awareness towards the difficulties were different. And, you know, at the later stage of my career, when I had to mentor younger developers, what I noticed was that there were gaps because they were still trying to understand the language, figuring out how that has to be translated, or better yet, translating business requirements using that language. And then at the end of the day, what is the expectation of a lead when the guy is present on the way that you're going to code? And what I saw is that a lot of people come out when they get the chance to go to the university, because I myself didn't have that chance. I had to learn it from the web and from reading books. I'm one of those that still likes to consume books. And it's just not being aware that things are there. So I think that, you know, it isn't easy to actually, and I had that experience with some people, particularly regarding the type of personalities that you have to work with, because you have the passionate ones that will, you know, you give them a little bit and they will try to find everything else. And those guys tend to be very good. And then you have the other ones that just don't care about it at all. But you need to reach to those as well. And what I've seen also a lot of times, unfortunately, is that the ones that don't care tend to move faster forward, and then you'll have leaders that are not as good as you expect in business, and then you have all of the problems that come with it. And then there's the business perspective of this, you know, the practices, the lack of the budget, or, you know, particularities of, you know, you hire a freelance that does things in a very particular way for a very long time, and he keeps on repeating the same mistakes, and because of the lack of contact with other people, he's not aware. So how do you get to these people? You know, so the idea of the developer conferences, I would have loved to have somebody that would show me an SQL injection in the beginning of my career. And I'm for sure there would be a lot of other developers that would love to have something like that. And even today, when I try to find something more extra, you know, a CVE or something, what is it about? I do understand that we want to protect. I'm going to ask you that as a question, I guess. I would love to know more about particularities of certain things that were discovered. I understand that most of them we don't want them to be disclosed because they could be abused. But to what extent would that actually be a bad thing? You know, because I would be aware of how it was done and I could protect myself.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
One of the problems that I have with security through obscurity is that it's not very obscure to the people who actually understand it. If you know that there is a bug in a piece of firmware and you have reverse engineering skills and you understand the bug class, you're going to find that same bug in a short time. If you are a developer of that firmware and you never learn about how that bug class actually works, and you're not told exactly where this might be an issue or which parameter or whatever the case may be, you are never fixing it. It's going to stay a vulnerability forever. And so I actually do have a problem with, you know, disclosure that never happens. I do think probably there's an area between full disclosure and responsible disclosure or coordinated disclosure that is a happy place, but to never disclose, I think, is a problem. Lockpicking is an example of, there's a great YouTube channel, and I strongly recommend everyone give it a go because most of his videos are very short, called The Lockpicking Lawyer. Now, this gentleman is a lawyer by trade, but he is, in my view, a master locksmith. He can, you know, get into almost every single lock in a few minutes. Sometimes you know, he's used a piece of Lego to get into a lock. So we're not talking specialist skills. So if you think about that, that industry has been made better through more people understanding how locksmithing actually works and being able to do lockpicking themselves. And the easy availability of lockpicking tools has made stronger locks over the last 20 years. There are lots of terrible locks still on the market, and that's not going away. But for the people who truly care about this stuff, there are better choices because of, you know, lockpicking sports and whatnot. Whether or not, I don't think full disclosure is correct. I think, honestly, that gives a lot of people a terrible surprise. I think Heartbleed was the last example of where the problem became incredibly apparent to a lot of people who had the skill to reverse engineer it. And within a short time, everybody was being exploited. That's an example, I think, of where it didn't work. And that's an example of where I think, you know, it didn't give the folks who are building OpenSSL and other SSL stacks the time to understand the issue and then how to actually resolve the issue. And it caused a lot of problems. It caused a fork of the OpenSSL code. I don't know the things that were improved in that other version of OpenSSL have been merged back. And so there's a lot of confusion with it. I think coordinated disclosure is probably the best alternative, but to never disclose, I think, is a problem.
To an extent, you can split the discussion on disclosure versus demos. You know, you can mock up the equivalent of Heartbleed in a fake SSL, in a fake service that just shows memory disclosure vulnerabilities. Certainly, showing or having examples of why, how something works and why or how a particular vulnerability can be exploited is incredibly valuable. You know, from personal experience with engineers that have just graduated, one of them hadn't come across because never been discussed cross-site scripting. I mean, this was early 2000s. And quick 30-second walkthrough, we went right back to basics on the whiteboard. They got it straight away. It was a 10-minute job. And they didn't understand the problem, so didn't understand why it needed to be fixed. But a little bit of short piece of education. They got it. They understood it, and it made a huge difference to their knowledge, interest, motivation, all of the above. So I definitely agree that we showing how things are found, or how vulnerabilities are found and how they're exploited helps.
Absolutely.
I don't. Sorry, just to add, I don't feel we're short of examples on that though from various security conferences. You know, there are an awful lot of offensive talks submitted to security conferences. Whether someone's gone through and pulled them all in as a catalog them, saying, okay, if you want to understand about how SQL injection works, go and have a look at this. If you want to understand what can go wrong with JWTs, go and have a look at that. Is of course a different question, but I don't think we're short of any material there.
Yeah, there was a channel called Christian0008 that was on YouTube that literally the guy went to every single major conference and he had thousands and thousands and thousands of those sorts of offensive style talks. I have tried to submit defensive and build talks to many conferences, and in fact, in the late 2000s, I had a lot of whingers about Black Hat and DEF CON rejecting those talks, and counting up the number of defensive and build talks compared to the number of other talks. And I remember one year it was like 213 talks, and 4 of them were on web app security, and all 4 were offensive. I think things have changed. but I still think you're right. We need to have more defensive and builder talks rather than offensive talks. I think that's been done to death. I personally I learn through doing. I think sitting in front and getting, presented to death, is that a way where we could help developers by helping them build secure code by doing rather than presenting? Because, you've got plural sites, you've got the secure code warrior, you've got, Linda and all those other ones. You've got plenty of talks on Oels YouTube channel, for example. I don't know that it's made a lot of difference. Is it better that we try to work on things that help developers build better code?
You're saying that people, quickly just Paul, they tend to copy paste things from, what's the name of the website now? I forget.
Stack Overflow.
Yeah, Stack Overflow, thank you. And the reason for that is that, you might be pressured through time, or it might just be a very complicated piece of code that you're just trying to find a solution for. It tends to be more towards time pressure, right? So if you do have something that can be easily consumed, like going to the most common problems, then it would actually make sense. But it comes down still to awareness, I think, because like the example Jonathan was giving, we can mentor when we are aware of it, but if people are not aware of it, they will not even do a Google search on it. So when you're presenting a specific, I don't know, come up with some design pattern that solves a particular problem, you would also only go towards looking for what a singleton is. If you had awareness towards it, you might create one without knowing what it is. So it's participating at the lower level type of conversations on the most common problems. What are those? Now that's a different topic. I'd have to think about it. But I would just have to look back and see exactly where I had to spend a lot of time. Or the repetitive tasks that we try to avoid by creating our own code libraries and where we could apply things. So, Paul, you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the point that Jonathan made was quite pertinent. Is we're not short on material of examples, but I think that's great. There's also part of the problem because as someone who's still on quite a steep learning curve for all vulnerabilities and how to defensively code against them, kind of thing. It's kind of there's all right. You start eating the elephant one bite at a time, kind of thing. But there's so much material to take on board that that's where I think that the tooling helps because all right, it's not perfect, but you can scan through your code and you'll get some feedback on the mistakes you've made and the vulnerabilities you may have introduced, kind of thing. And then the tooling I've seen, some of them will give a click through, and then you get more information about that. And then that falls into what Andre is saying, is that you're aware of it, then, and you can read up on that, and you can build up your code bit by bit. And so I think that's one useful way I've found of using the tooling to expand knowledge in different areas, because you've got that chink of knowledge, and then you can build on that, and then start wading through the seeds of material that Jonathan said is definitely out there.
So I was thinking about it, and I guess I have two separate ideas, but one, people should be able to just roll their eyes at a pen tester, if that makes sense. So like, it should be common enough, the principles of that are held in pen testing should be common enough that people are like, that I'm not going to fall for that. That's kind of stupid. If you think about it from that angle, you have to try to kind of normalize the concepts of security and of breaking, breaking the apps or breaking whatever it is, the system that you're working with. So in a sense, debugging, right, is something that is normalized. It's out there. What if we had a system similar to that, but for pen testing, that actually tried the vulnerabilities of the system as it was being coded?
Yeah.
It actually tested for vulnerabilities as it was coded. And so the whole coding environment would have to be probably, isolated, but it would allow for actually more secure code development. And yeah, you're going to have to go a little ways before you run it to make sure that you actually have, more, I mean, you're not going to run it as frequently as you would a debugger per se, but you definitely want to run it pretty frequently.
I think Checkmarks has a tool that does something like this in terms of automation, although I've never actually used their software, but I think it goes towards a bit what you're talking about.
So,
Solutions.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Are you? Please go on.
Go ahead, John, please.
So there's when you look across different threats or vulnerability classes, there are different methods that are effective for finding them. Some are very easy to identify in source code. Some are very easy to so effectively static fast static analysis testing. Some are very easy to detect through dynamic testing. Others may be due to numbers. You need some form of active protection. So when you get into, when you get into native languages with buffer overflows, double freeze, etc., you're looking at compiler mitigations for them. A lot of it on how do you surface the best practices to engineers, I think depends on the context. And to what Wallaby was saying, the DAST is one of the tools in your toolbox for doing that, but it's not the only one.
I think of it. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think of it kind of like the magician's box with all the swords that go into it, right? But also in terms of something like a pipeline. So at each stage, it's getting hit with a different part, and like if you stick something into the VirusTotal website, right? It goes through how many different antivirus programs before it actually shows you, all right, this is the results from each of them, right? So basically you're hitting it with different the different approaches, like you're sticking swords in this box, right? They're coming from all angles, but at the same time it's in kind of an order of fashion that is from the beginning to the end, and it becomes a normalized part of the process that each of those parts get hit. That would save so much money and so many issues over the long run, that even though it's labor intensive to actually create and develop that kind of process as its own type of field, like anti-malware software is a type of field, right? It has its own almost type of field, a type of work environment and market in itself, but each one sticking a different sword in there and just making sure that you don't actually want whatever it is to survive, like in the magician's box, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Integrating. I'll use the thing. All of your tooling into the pipeline is superb. If I know reality is a little bit more complicated than that, when you get some SaaS tools in an unconfigured state maybe will surface an awful lot of potential false positives. It's a very laudable goal.
And I mean, honestly, the false positives would be useful in and of themselves if you think about it. They show you kind of what to be careful of as you go forward through that section. It's not like a false positive would be useless in that case.
In that particular context around false positives, we have to be cognizant of engineering time. I've certainly seen a great deal of pushback from both as an engineer and from a security auditor researcher, if a tool is too noisy, it'll get switched off. A very silly example was one place I worked had a tool that would check for tabs and spaces and reject your check-in if you had tabs. In an ideal world, that should have been automated as part of the check-in process. Yeah. There are, I think it's Mario that talks about cognitive load. Things like false positives across all tools, if you can get rid of them, they just drive down the cognitive load on the developer engineer who is looking after that, giving them time to focus on the business logic, the problem domain that they're working on.
No, I agree with that. I was just thinking about using one thing you get in another area rather than presenting it all directly to the developer. You want to be able to check for that same thing in a different way. So whether it's something as simple, as having like something that can come up, in a framework, having something that could show, hey, I have a list of things that can be easily removed out of sight or whatever. Initially, after a while, you're going to want to automate all of the different parts. But at least if you can open that up and it's like, okay, we're showing what is likely to be a false positive for this. Just be cautious that you don't do this. Those kinds of little hints, and something that can easily be tucked away, but specifically for those things that you recognize are in fact areas that could have more false positives than otherwise, and then eventually take that and use it for more processing as the tool gets developed more, as the framework gets developed more.
So one of the things that we do see at some of these larger organizations, if you look at the Netflix link that I sent, the Medium link about Netflix's Paved Road, they actually do have a lot of these tools built in like that. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that if developers are hidden from the output of security tools, they're not aware and don't value them. If we use the same tools the developers use, they are much more invested in trying to resolve them. So one of the areas that I do like is in Ide plugins, things that can actually, as you start typing and you're starting to do the autocomplete, like the IntelliSense type of deal, it can provide you a hint that this is how you correctly use this, rather than wait until it's fully compiled, do static analysis and all of those wonderful things.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's one of the areas that I think we could definitely improve on, is helping developers at write time, not just compile time, and not just at check-in time, but we need, as I think you mentioned, Wallaby, that it needs to be in many different places. It's not just one tool fits all. It's many different types of tools without overwhelming them. So that cognitive load issue that was talked about, I do think that's an important issue. Many static code analysis tools produce thousands and thousands of warnings, and where do you even start?
Having multiple, just continuing with this, having multiple places that will identify potential issues. So during IntelliSense or nudging whilst developing, hooks during check-in to ban certain types of APIs, as an example. We're in the C world, having something that if it sees struct copy, chucks your code straight back at you and says no, do it again, through to integration of tooling in the CI/CD pipeline, so your DAS tools, your SAS tools, or no one single method, I think, is, even if you take one bug class, it's not often that there's one single approach or method that is 100% effective, and it's really a combination of all of those. And yeah, absolutely, to use the tools that engineering or developers are already using is definitely the way forwards. It's funny, on the Node.js side of things, I've worked with a few engineering teams that have used it, but I've not seen the developer environments that they're using. Most of it just tends to be text editors. Maybe I've missed something. But yeah, a lot of the debugging I saw was well, equivalent of printf debugging. You know, it's debugging 101.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the time, and I know that we started a little late, but I do want to get to working on outcomes. One of the important things of this and previous summits is that outcomes come around from having a discussion. I just want to summarize what we've talked about, and then maybe get some prioritization from you folks about things that I think are more important than others, that maybe Oels could work on, maybe the ASVS project could work on, maybe the community itself needs to work on through Stack Exchange or whatever. So in no particular order, except for I've written it down. One of the first things we discussed was to work out, based around framework and language popularity, do a mapping on whether or not those languages or frameworks have specific issues, and maybe use the ASVS or the top 10 as being, does this language or framework actually have that particular protection or eliminates the bug class completely? And then a second part to that would be to write a CISO CTO version of this to help them choose better languages in the future, but also to help developers with a more technical version of that on how to actually resolve it with the gaps. So some sort of Oels top 10 filter or ASVS filter, so that they get a unique version of it. So the first recommendation or outcome, I think, is actually, if we look at it as a meta thing, is what are the most common frameworks and languages? What are the gaps they have? Produce an executive summary version of it and a developer summary version of it. Do we think this is a good outcome? Something that's worth working on?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep,
Okay.
definitely. Personal preference, I like to probably start with the ASVS and work backwards because it's more specific than the top 10, but that's just a personal preference.
I think, honestly, the way that top 10 is, it's an awareness piece. It's not testable. I think at the end of the day, if we're trying to specifically hone in on things, the top 10 is actually very poor. It's got 43 CWEs, whereas the ASVS, you know, has 200 or 300 items. Picking one level or another might be the way to go. So some sort of CTO analysis and some sort of developer focus on how to use, address gap. Got a comment here from Wallaby.
Yeah, so that's for when we get to the part about what we just talked about a little bit ago.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so there was a good emphasis throughout the entire session on practical ways developers can learn about, like, surface and discover issues. And there were some good examples of that. I think one of the ones that kept on getting brought up is Stack Overflow. So essentially, what I'm going to go with is like Defense of the Dark Arts, but done on Stack Overflow. Is that what we're trying to discover, or sorry, suggest as being a good developer-focused area because of time crunch and where they go to look for things?
I think Stack Overflow is for for most developers is the first go-to resource, and even if you're not intentionally going there, it'll be when you put a query in, it's going to be in the top couple of responses that come back. So it's inevitably where you end up. It is a community area, and so you do have to look at how many votes and things that an answer's got to know whether it's the best answer to go with or not. But I think if it's definitely the go-to resource for developers to use.
What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reach out to the Stack Exchange folks and see if there's a way that we could actually have a knowledge base that we could get linked to. So when they search for certain terms, that knowledge base comes up as one of the answers as well. Because I don't think there's much to go, like there's going to be a huge amount of gaps at start. And honestly, the community answering the questions, developer to developer is a good way of doing it. I think one of the problems we've had in the security community for a long time is that we think we know the best way when in fact we may not. And so having the community still answer, I think, is an important aspect of it. That having, verified or this is the actual problem you're trying to solve, and these are some of the suggested ways of doing it, and then look at some of the other answers that have been provided and upvoted, I think you're going to be good. I think I will reach out to the Stack Overflow people and see if we can collaborate on that, or whether we just simply use the standard mechanism. We've had some stuff where we've talked about outreach and developer conferences and testing conferences. I think this is a really good idea. We should continue to try to do this. I think I hadn't thought about tester conferences before. I must admit that did slip my mind. But we also learned about AWS reInvent and other ones. So some sort of targeted conferences with relevant material. So I want to just delve into this a little bit. If you were a developer, and I know some of you are, and you had an AWS session on security, what would encourage you to attend? Is it we're providing you a solution, or is it that we're discussing a problem you need to know about? What is the reason why you would attend the session and not, or more particularly, you wouldn't attend?
I think if it was specifically on some esoteric problem, then I would be less likely to attend. I'd be more likely to attend if it's going to be addressing the stuff that is going to hit me day on day. So yeah, that would draw me. Whereas something that's a bit off the wall and an edge case, I might not hit that ever. So I'm not too concerned that will be lower on my priority list.
Yep, no, that's fair. I totally agree. I once attended a session at a Microsoft conference on the cluster service, and the poor lady doing the demos, it was very esoteric, and I was very interested because I was working in a hospital situation. We were interested in the Microsoft clustering, but none of the demos worked, the poor lady. And it was so esoteric that I was one of 3 people left by the end of the actual session. And I felt so sorry for her because all of the demos failed. And what she was demonstrating was really critically important to a very few number of people.
Oops.
Okay. I'm sad.
I think we can sum that up in relevance. If it's relevant to the language, the runtime or the environment that you're using, and it's an area that you're interested in or have been bitten by, you'll attend, or you're more likely to attend. Sorry.
Yeah. There were some suggestions around being ahead of the curve. One of the problems that I've had with the ASVS is that we do have some controls in there that are terribly ahead of the curve. We had one that was asked to be introduced on memory safety in terms of clearing memory, and that's still not done very often. Is this an area that we need to concentrate on, or is this an area that could be a second or third? So I'm talking about concurrency, memory issues, Rust or Go specific serverless issues. are these areas that we should get ahead of so we become an authority figure in, or is it one of those areas that we should prioritize less compared to the others?
Sounds like less.
Yeah, agree. Even though I like the idea of trying to get ahead of the curve, that we've got enough collectively as an industry, we've got enough security baggage to keep us going for a really long time.
Yeah. The shared responsibility stuff, I think, is actually in the same boat. That's a conversation for a very small community. It might be worthwhile having some roundtables with the right people, but I don't know that it's going to be one of those pushes.
Sorry, what was the shared responsibility?
So when Ben was on, we talked about how AWS and other platforms are responsible for things like making sure that if you're on a hyper-threaded virtual instance, that people can't then scrape your memory and things like that. That is
sorry,
definitely
I'd missed the context.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a niche conversation for a very important area, but certainly it's not one of those ones that I think we should focus on above these others. Ben was very interested in doing some mapping between the various things, and I think he's already done the work. So I'll have a conversation with Ben around his work in this area, because it's an area that I actually have on my to-do list of one item, and that is essentially getting collaboration going with the World Economic Forum. They've got an equivalent thing happening here. Then we brought up, Andre brought up university curricula. I think this is an area that's of immense importance. Andre, do you mind if I reach out to you later on this one?
Oh, please do.
There was a session last week or the week before by the OS Cambridge leader, Adrian W. Sorry, I forget his surname. On this, he is a lecturer at the Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. So I know he's very interested in this area.
Okay. So Andre, I'll get out and reach out to you, and if someone could just forward me Adrian's details, either via Twitter or email, I'd love to be able to hook up, because quite frankly, this is an area that I think OWASP could lead in. We're actually thinking about certification and education programs, because we do need to, so Dever, okay, no worries.
I'll try and connect you with him.
Yeah. Okay, cool. One of those things then is we at OS are trying to figure out how to make money in times when we can't have conferences. And I think having a certification and education program that's linked together, that's open source and freely available to the world, is one of those key areas that achieves our mission. That actually finding out what people have actually been working on already and supporting them is going to be critical, I think, rather than trying to start again.
I would love to be a part of that.
Yeah, I'll put a call out. If you could just email me or Twitter DM me, my DMs are open, your details, and we'll get a little working group together, because I think this is a critical one. It's really quite important, because it's one of those areas that, you know, I'm constantly surprised that, you know, if you're a mechanical engineer and you don't know about point loads, how are you even an engineer? Security is not taught to a lot of folks. It's an optional course, and the depth is often lacking. And so, you know, it'd be really nice for us to be able to have something for universities to be able to adopt, either an open source curricula or point people at lectures they can pick up for optional credit or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, happy to help with that as well. Okay,
cool. So the check-in processes one, I'm going to leave this in the tooling discussion. We've got another session with Daniel Cuthbert and myself on gaps in the OS one. This is obviously a critical area, and many places like GitHub have actually invested a lot of money in it. I certainly think this is a worthy discussion to continue, and the session that we're having this afternoon is to look at those gaps from the OS perspective. But certainly I think I'm hearing loud and clear that check-in processes, pipeline assistance is one of those areas that we could collaborate with frameworks and languages on. If you look at the way the Go compiler works, it literally has no flags. There's no flags whatsoever. So if you're going to build something into a language that has no flags, we need to be able to collaborate closely with the team to make sure that those things are not overdone. We did talk about tooling in terms of getting there whilst the developers are actually coding. So some sort of IDE helper or some sort of a, it looks like you're trying to use this API, this is the correct way of using it. So expand knowledge through tooling. Again, I think that comes down to the session we're having this afternoon. I'm very happy to continue talking about this one because I think it's an area that OWASP is lacking quite definitively. There are tools in the area, but many of them cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And sometimes, like static code analysis tools, it may be impossible for us to do anything because of patents. Wallaby, you talked about essentially, debugging and then essentially making that as, unsurprising for penetration testers as possible. Sorry,
not
for
just
developers.
Not just like debugging per se, but in a similar type of framework. And I was thinking about it. If you add a security view, it can take and compile all the positives, false or not, and the viewer can actually sort them.
Yep.
And arrange them based on what they know is likely to be a real positive or false positive, or what kind of vulnerability they're looking for, sort it based on the information that they're looking for, and make it more usable. That way it doesn't have to be right on that view that, is gonna, blind, not really, but, kind of blind the developer. Instead, it's gonna be something that can be looked at separately and categorized, something that can be understood in a comprehensive way, comprehensible.
There are tools out there that do something very similar. There's IAST tools like Context, and various other ones as well. But there's also dynamic tools that do reporting and have a dashboard. So there are commercial tools in this area. I do understand what you're saying here. I think if you can make it, do come to our session this afternoon and discuss the issue, because I think delving into that sort of tooling maybe outside of the languages and frameworks sort of view that I'm trying to help with here. But I think it's an important aspect of maybe assisting developers getting that, reduced cognitive load and making it more usable that you're talking about. I think that's an incredibly important area.
I think it's a follow-on. So initially identifying, say, from ASVS what the it's almost a really nice evolution. Take ASVS, take the issues, look at what languages do or don't provide protection or mitigations for them. Next, when you move on to what are the standard developer tools or pipeline tools that exist for said languages. From there, you then move on to the question of, okay, well, how can we provide hints to developers through their IDEs? Next stage, how can we prevent these from being checked in? Next stage, if we can't prevent them being checked in, is there tooling that we can use to detect them through Wast, SAST runtime that we can surface as warnings there? Next stage, if all of those fail, what are the protection mechanisms that we should have in place for those? And it's a really nice evolution, or a really nice flow from the initial ASVS tests.
Yeah.
As I said, there is actually another session that's running concurrently to this one on ASVS and testing.
Yeah.
And I would love to have been at that one too, but I can't be in two places at once.
Yeah, I looked at the schedule and went, oh, I need to be somewhere else. Sorry, I need to be in two places at once.
I'd love to be able to put myself in a photocopier and have both for Tenzing. I'll definitely be reviewing that after this. Okay, so essentially it sounds like there's the, well, roughly 7 things that we talked about, which is, gap analysis, working with Stack Overflow, working with conferences to increase developer awareness, testers and whatnot, university curricula, build out tooling in multiple stages and work with, protection mechanisms and whatnot. And lesser priority, but still an outcome, is to think about being ahead of the curve, but less priority, and shared responsibility, again, less priority. Are there any other things that we have not talked about that should be part of the outcomes for this session?
All right. That's it?
Okay. I do appreciate everyone coming. I really, and contributing. It's been very, very insightful for me and helpful. So has anyone got other closing comments? Okay. Again, thank you so much, guys. I do appreciate it. I will follow up with some of you after this on the university curricula and some tooling discussions. I'd certainly like to, if anyone, I'll get back with Ben on the gap analysis and the mappings and things like that. If anyone wants to be participating in that as well, just again, reach out to me on Twitter.
Thank you. Thank you for a great session. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Good job.
No worries. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
No worries.
Thank you. Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much.